hear so many players say, I want to get better at Limited, but I don't know where to start. The good news is that just like so many RPGs, Magic the Gathering Limited has a skill tree. In this video, I'm going to do an overview of the skills you can work on to improve your Limited gameplay and share the skill tree I've created to help you explore those skills and access new resources. Let's jump into it. Before I get started, a few notes on the skill tree. The first thing is that if you want to follow along and check out the skill tree for yourself, the link is in the description down below. The second thing is that over time, as I do more deep dives on specific skills, I will be adding resources to the skill tree so that you can find everything you need to get better all in one place. But for now, use it as a prompt to think through the types of skills that you can work on as you're looking for other content to get better. If you want to see the deep dives on these skills as they come out, make sure that you're subscribed. I'm on a path to leveling up my competitive Limited gameplay, and I created the Limited Lab as a way to share my process and all the things I learned along the way. If you want to support the project, please follow along at patreon.com/thelimitedlabmtg. The link is also in my bio. Another thing I just want to note about the skill tree, you can access it in two ways. You can either look at the full skill tree like this, where you can look around on your own and you can zoom in and look at the different skills and explore it this way sort of manually. Or if you want, you can go through the diagnostic that I've created where you're not really sure how you want to improve and you want to go through some of these questions that help you think through the different ways that you can get better. And so feel free to explore this in whatever way makes the most sense to you. And let me know in the comments what's the most helpful. All right. So when we're thinking about improving at Limited, there are two main categories or types of skills that we're talking about. We're talking about skills that either improve your deck quality or improve your ability as a pilot. I think when most people think about getting better at Limited, they're thinking about deck quality, usually because they're thinking about drafting better or building better sealed pools. So that's where a lot of the improvement focus goes. But there's also a huge element, especially if you're trying to cross over from a pretty good player into an excellent player, that all comes from piloting. And I'm going to talk about both of these things. I think the piloting is actually one of the most underrated. And I think it's one of those things that people don't even realize that they're making decisions some of the times. But those decisions are really impactful on whether they're winning or losing these games. So I'll talk about both, but let's start with deck quality just because I think that's something that people get really focused on. So the four main categories of skills when we're talking about improving your deck quality come down to drafting, building sealed pools, deck construction fundamentals, and format awareness. When most people think about getting better in Limited, the first thing they think about is drafting. And this is partly because drafting is really fun. It's the main reason that people get into Limited. They like to draft. They like to experience what it's like to build new decks in different formats and pick one card at a time. And it's a really fun way to play Magic. It's also very challenging to do really well. And so there's some basic skills that we're talking about, like learning how to stay open, learning how to choose colors, focusing on early picks versus picking later in the pack, when to pivot, those sorts of things. And those are some of the basic skills that a lot of MTG Limited content creators have focused on. So go look at Limited level ups or Limited resources or any of these other drafting archetypes or any of these other content creators. There's so much there's so much content to pull from there. And I'll be creating more content about that soon. And I think but there's a lot there to get started with. There's also some more advanced skills that you might not be thinking about, like reading signals or sending signals, or when to draft towards synergy versus generic card quality, or even just how to be more aware about specific sets. And as I talk about when I talk about format awareness, which is the last skill here, I have actually already released a video on the Explore method, which is a method that I use to become quickly aware of new sets, and I'll link that right here. The second really important skill when we're talking about improving at Limited is building sealed pools. So I think that sealed pools get a rep as being totally variance-based and totally luck-based, but actually there's a lot of skill that is involved in building a good sealed pool. This is something that you'll see because at these big tournaments or these big Limited qualifiers, you'll see that the same names or like really good Magic players consistently do well on sealed events. And it's not luck. It's not all luck. Obviously, you can get better or worse cards in your pool, but a good Limited player is 90% of the time able to make a decent pool out of whatever they've gotten. And that's because they are learning how to build to the power in their pool. They are good at identifying the constraints of their pool. They're assessing power in the format, right? So that they know not just is my deck good, but is my deck good compared to other decks that I'm going to be seeing that are trying the same game plan. And they also have just a very important mindset, which is that they have agency when building in sealed, right? I think that a lot of people just say, well, my pool sucks and so I didn't do well. But if you can really cultivate a strong mindset about your ability to be successful in sealed, that's really important. I'm going to do some deep dive videos on sealed specifically coming soon, so keep an eye open for that. The third skill that's really important when we're talking about building good decks in limited environments is some of the deck construction basics. So we're talking about deck plan, we're talking about mana and fixing, we're talking about curve, we're talking about energy, we're talking about card advantage. If you feel like you're building decks and they seem like they're good, but they're not performing the way that you want to, thinking about some of these things is really going to help you out. There's also some more advanced deck construction topics, like thinking about the types of assertive decks that you can build and making sure that you are going into a lane where your assertive deck has reach. Then we're also talking about the different types of attrition decks that you can build, the different types of decks that are trying to leverage the late game and out attrition their opponent. There's lots of different types of those types of decks, and knowing which one you are and what the weaknesses and the strengths are of those decks is really important. And then also fixing. I think fixing is one of those things that people really, really, really take for granted. And when you're not thinking about your fixing, it can really mess up your deck. I'm going to be releasing some videos on this content soon, so stay tuned. I'm really excited to do the fixing one, especially because I think this is something I've really honed in on over the years, is how to make sure that my mana base is really functional, and knowing what types of fixing enable the plan that I have. And then the last skill in the deck construction arena is just format awareness. And this is something that I think a lot of people take for granted. But I've just released a video on the Explore posture, which again, I'll link here. And if you are interested in learning more about the format, thinking about how you can make sense of the different axes that every format operates on, that video is for you. And so check it out and let me know what you think in the comments. So now I'm going to switch over and focus on the skills on the piloting sides of things. And as you'll notice, there's actually a lot more skills highlighted here than there was in the deck building side. And while I think deck building in a lot of ways determines the absolute ceiling of the power of your games, right? Like if your deck is really, really, really terrible and the mana is bad, you're just going to have a lot of non-games and it's going to make you lose right away. And you're going to lose to people who have better decks than you. But I think that the difference between going from like a 55% win rate and a 75% win rate, all of that comes from piloting, or I think a lot of it comes from piloting. So let's start off by talking about some of the basics of piloting. The first thing, and I think this is really underrated, is that if you want to get better at piloting, you need to be tracking your games. If I'm talking about, there's a couple different ways you can do that, but the first and most obvious one is just to use 17 lands. If you haven't already downloaded 17 lands to use as a game tracking engine, I know a lot of people just use it for the card, looking at the card stats, but if you haven't used it to track your games, do that now. And I'm telling you, it's the most important thing you can do, because it gives you the opportunity to look back at your games and go through them and see, what decision did I make here? How did it play out? In a way that you just can't if you're relying on your memory about how your games went and how well you did. So go ahead and download 17 Lands client and put it on your computer. This is not a advertisement. I'm not getting paid by them. It's just amazing, and you got to do it. I'll put the link in the description here for a video on how to do that. I also will be releasing some more structured content on how to use the Limited Lab notebook to reflect on your games and sort of analyze your gameplay decisions, and I'll be having that content for you soon. Next, it might seem obvious, but brushing up on your rules and your fundamentals is really, really important, right? So I was just in a tournament where I learned some edge case rules that I didn't know. For example, I'm put the example here: applying overkill damage to a single blocker. I had a situation where that came up at a tournament I was out recently. I didn't know that you could assign excess damage to a blocker and not kill the second blocker if someone double blocked. And that actually made a really big difference for my games, right? So knowing some of these edge case rules, if you're an experienced player, is actually really, really helpful. But if you're a newer player, learning the fundamental rules and interactions and remembering and ordering triggers and things like that, honestly, are the biggest thing you need to get out of your way. So I put a link to one of those videos here. This is from the Tolarian Community College, but I'll be trying to add some more resources here. But just Google or YouTube, look on YouTube for basics of Magic, and you'll find some good content for that. Another really underappreciated area in Magic is the meta skills. So I think at a basic level, people don't realize how much tilt affects games. I was just in a tournament where a player made a mistake and they played the rest of the game tilted, and I was able to take advantage of that, and they basically had given up already, even though the game was very winnable for them, but they had just gotten so frustrated that they weren't really in it anymore. And so managing tilt is really important. But then, honestly, one of the biggest things that I think separates really good Magic players from okay Magic players is noticing decision points. And this is something that if you're ever watching any of my lab sessions, it's something I'm really working on in my own improvement is noticing when did I make a decision? When did I do something either because I autopilot where I just breezed through something because it seemed like there was an obvious choice, or when did I not notice that I actually had a decision fork? And I think that that is one of the most important things that you can do is just notice that you're noticing when you have the opportunity to make decisions so that you can improve the quality of those decisions. And in those similar lines, being aware of what lines are available to you whenever those decision points come up is really, really important. Next, we have combat decisions. So, of course, we have our combat fundamentals. Attacking and blocking, working on those things is really helpful. Taking damage, multi-blocking, or chump blocking. This is something I see a lot with newer players where they think they need to chump block all the time when they don't realize that their life total is a resource, right? So, working on some of these basic skills can really help you in combat. But there's also more advanced skills like racing, playing around interaction, or recognizing lethal and maximizing damage that will help you win games that were unwinnable otherwise, or will help you lose games where you were actually ahead if you had just done them correctly, right? So I think that these skills are really important when you're trying to improve at combat, and combat is how most Magic games are won. So it's a really important area to improve. Next, we're talking about sequencing, right? So how we sequence our lands, how we sequence our spells, how we use our mana, whether we're playing on curve or holding out for a stronger play, whether we're disrupting our opponent's board or developing our own board, or whether we're choosing to play for value or for tempo, right? These are sequencing decisions that matter a lot and affect the whole way that the game plays out. It can be from as simple as something as I played the wrong land, and so we didn't have access to a double pip spell in my hand, or I didn't play a tap land early enough, so now I can't play on curve. But it goes all the way to am I trying to make value plays or tempo plays, and which one is more important here, and how does that shift the way that I'm approaching the game at a fundamental level, right? So these are different skills that you might not think about as being skills or as being decisions, but they are, and they really make a big difference. The next category is about pregame decisions. So these pregame decisions matter a lot, right? So mulliganing, I think, is actually, I'm going to do a whole little series on mulliganing because while it seems really intuitive, I'm actually not sure that it is. And I have so many non-games that are just because I kept a bad hand or I kept a risky hand. And I want to really get into the math uh, on what makes a good mulligan decision. And so actually I put it in the basics category, but I think there's probably some very advanced mulligan work that I'm going to be learning more about. So I'll be sharing that whenever I get into that on a deep dive. And then there's decisions like the play draw decision. In modern Magic, it feels like being on the play is really helpful a lot of the time, but I still see a lot of players who are choosing to be on the draw. And I'm actually not convinced that it's always wrong to choose a draw, but that's an example of something that you want to be doing intentionally versus just doing without realizing the consequences of that by putting your opponent in a positive tempo position, right? So these are pregame decisions that matter a lot. Sort of similar to pregame decisions, we have best of three or match decisions. And these are decisions that you're making whenever you're in a best of three match with an opponent. And I think the most obvious one that comes up here is sideboarding, because there are different types of sideboarding, which I'll be talking about in a sideboarding deep dive sometime soon. But then there's also things like changing your plan based on your opponent's deck, right? If your opponent was really, really aggressive, maybe you need to rethink the way that you're approaching the game so that you don't get run over. Or if your opponent had the better late game than you, maybe you need to change your plan to push damage early and become the aggressor, become the beatdown, right? Even if that wasn't your original plan. That's an example of changing your plan, and it can really switch games around. And then the other thing is playing with gathered information. If we saw removal spells, if we saw combat tricks, if we saw things that were in game one that inform how we play in game two, or help us interpret how they're leaving up mana or what to use that for, that can all be really helpful, and those are really good skills to acquire and practice in your best of three games. Interaction is another category that's actually trickier than people think it is. Choosing your removal targets is not an easy thing to do. And also assessing the strengths and weaknesses of your removal keeps you from getting into awkward situations where you're playing against an opponent with burn spells, but their creatures all have big toughness and none of your removal kills any of their creatures, right? And I think that thinking through the role of removal in your deck and how to use counters and how to play around interaction and how to use board wipes. This is one that I mess up all the time. I feel like when I play with a board wipe, I often play it wrong and end up losing the game, even though I have this powerful tool at my advantage. And then there's also just the question of whether or not to hold up interaction or assert your position. This comes up for me all the time, and this is a very tricky decision point that is really helpful to think through the reasons to do one or the other. All right, 3 more categories of skills to go over. The first one is role and plan. And this is, I think that people probably hear this the most when they hear about the quote, who's the beatdown or are you the beatdown? And that's really what we're talking about when we're talking about the role. If you're identifying whether or not you're trying to survive or whether you're trying to get your opponent defeated, that is an important role choice that if you get it wrong, it can be devastating for your game. Similarly, sometimes you think you have a plan and you need to change your plan, and making that change at the right moment can be the difference between winning and losing. In a related skill set, we're talking about managing your opponent. So I already talked a little bit about playing with gathered information, but there's a lot of pretty complicated types of decisions that you have to make against that are more about playing your opponent, not just the deck that they have. And these include things like whether it's important to attack their mana resources, how you disrupt their plan, what information you're concealing versus revealing. Are you bluffing? Are you reading or respecting your opponent's bluffs? And are you accurately anticipating their moves? These are the sorts of things that really can help take your game to the next level, because once you start playing your opponent, you gain an advantage over in the game that you're playing. And then finally, the end game. Choosing a win condition or managing inevitability versus the risk of going long, right? These are advanced skills, and they're worth thinking about and exploring. And finally, managing variance. Managing variance is something that cuts across both deck building and piloting, and it's probably, in my opinion, it's maybe the most important skill that you can acquire, or skill set that you can acquire. Because even good Magic players have a 60% win rate, a 65% win rate, right? And that means that they're losing a lot of the time. And one of the main reasons that they're losing is because of variance. And that's actually one of the things that makes Magic fun, right? Is that it's a variance-based game. It's a game where there's a lot of luck involved, but you can do a lot to influence the way that variance affects you negatively when you're playing a game, right? And this includes both just the mindset I just described, which is claiming some power over the effect of variance, thinking about card draw and filtering your decks, thinking about mana and your fixing, and also just drafting in different ways, like drafting soup in ways that account for variance and help reduce the impacts of variance. And then there's also things just like some more advanced skills, just like mulligan math, like really thinking through what is the probability that I'm going to have X result whenever I mulligan X times, right? And I would say the same thing for mana and fixing. It's a lot about actually getting in the weeds and looking at the math of what risk am I accepting, and what risk, and that also always raises the question when you're talking about variance with what risk am I accepting, and do I need to accept that risk, and are there ways to reduce that risk, right? So I'll be doing a lot of content about this over the next couple of months, but it's a very important skill, and it's one that I take very seriously when I'm trying to think about improving at Limited. Well, I wanted to keep this video short. I'll be doing deeper dive videos on a lot of this content as the channel grows and as we continue to move on. But I wanted to give you a starting place as you're thinking about the types of skills that you can work on to get better at the game. Please leave comments in the description that tell me which areas you want me to focus on. I may or may not listen because I'm going to be focusing on the things that feel most important to me in my games, but I will take them into consideration. And I am also just genuinely really interested and excited to know what content is important to you and what skills matter to you the most. I will also be releasing some videos about some new tools that I'm helping to explore some of these areas, and I hope that you'll stay tuned for that. All right, thanks for listening, and bye-bye for now.